So, a little bit about what I do. I'm the Global Tech and Telecoms Analyst at Economist Intelligence that I mentioned. We're the research and analysis wing of the Economist Group. And we spend an incredible amount of time fielding questions on artificial intelligence and quantum, mainly clients trying to understand when is the ChatGPT moment of quantum going to happen. I think that's oversimplifying it, but that's the way someone put it to me. And I think everyone's curious about the real world applications, but what I find is every time there's an emerging technology, adoption or expansion truly happens when there's cross-border collaboration, when there's knowledge transfer, when there's a unified approach on standards and policy making, some sense of unilateral approach towards these things. So we have an expert panel representing the private sector, the government, and the academia. So this should be an exciting one for us to understand how governments across the globe are thinking about this. I'd like to begin with you, Tom, if I may. The UK government made a couple of interesting announcements on collaborations with regard to quantum research. You're thinking about it with the EU and also in Asia with Japan. Could you, one, briefly tell us what's the UK's national quantum mission like, the aim, the vision, and how do these research alliances with, say, Japan and the EU fit in?
Sure. So I'm Tom Newby. I'm the head of the UK's Office of Quantum Technologies, which sits in the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology. And my team stewards the National Quantum Strategy, essentially our national plan for how we advance quantum technologies in the UK and move from early research and commercialisation to adoption. So you can read the strategy online. It still stands, and that was well consulted on with the sector. And part of that is basically thinking about the next phase of this 10-year programme we've been running in the UK, continuing investing in great research, but thinking about what are the building blocks we need to go to scale. So some of that's about getting the infrastructure right, the skills right, and importantly, the international collaboration right. And that's right at the heart of what we do. So we do this in a few ways. We have bilateral partnerships with like-minded governments, and the most recent of those was with Japan that we signed a couple of weeks ago. Those are frameworks that sit over all sorts of collaboration between industry, between academia, and between governments. We have wider partnerships between our expert institutions on a bilateral basis, and then lots of multilateral engagement, whether that's through research programs like Quantera. Very happily, we've just been accepted to participate in the Horizon programs for quantum calls in the coming year, which I think is great for the UK sector. So we'll be collaborating with European partners there, but also with governments through forums like the OECD, the World Economic Forum, and some quantum-specific groups that have been set up. So it's really at the heart of how we think about our national strategy.
Interesting. And David, I know that at the Australian Trade Commission, you've spent the past couple of years really, going far and out, trying to build even the supply chain for quantum back home in Australia, and collaborating not just with the UK, but with a lot of other countries. What's the role that academic mobility plays in building these research linkages?
Yeah, thank you, Lavina. And thanks for the opportunity to sit on this fantastic panel. So as you mentioned, I'm with an agency called Austrade, the Australian Trade and Investment Commission. A big part of my remit is to help drive trade and investment between Australia and the UK. In some areas, that's the challenge. In this area, I must say, it is a pleasure because there's already such existing connections, people-to-people connections, institution-to-institution connections, organisation-to-organisation connections. And I think a lot of that really does stem from the people-to-people linkages. As you rightly put in your question around academic mobility, if you look around the Australian ecosystem, and we've got representatives that were just recently in Australia for the Quantum Australia conference, you meet with people in our research institutions, you meet with people that are CEOs and founders of organisations. You'll hear a lot of accents that don't sound like mine, right? And I think that is somewhat the DNA of Australia. 30% of our population was born overseas. 50% when you look at their parents were born overseas. So by nature, we have this international global outlook in everything that we do. We've got people like Professor Michelle Simmons, who was born right here in London, that's heading up one of our centres of excellence in Australia, and also the founder of Silicon Quantum Computing. You've got folks like Michael Bierczek, who from Q Control that has an American accent, and Jared Milburn, who is people will recognise as well, is from my home city of Brisbane. So I think that has really been instrumental in driving the research linkages, but now that's evolving into the commercial linkages as well as we mature.
Excellent. Excited to hear more about it. We'll probe you and Tom a bit further on that. But moving on to Joe, I think this is probably a face everyone's familiar with. The minute you Google quantum and the International Year of Quantum, you will come across a session by Joe. So he's played a very important role alongside his peers and colleagues in having this year proclaimed as the International Year of Quantum. You were describing it in one of the sessions, and that really caught my interest, where you said it was not just about raising awareness about the technology among the academic community, but trying to understand and convey the impact it could have for society and for humanity. And, I think it's fair to ask of you, as the UN and other multilateral organizations work with governments on quantum, how do we ensure that this technology is equitably accessible to not just the developed world, but also emerging economies?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. Thanks. I'm Joe Niemelat, so I was chairing the committee which brought this through the United Nations, and so this gave me an opportunity. So I'd say the first thing was just getting governments together, and we had a lot of sessions both at UNESCO and the United Nations in New York to inform governments about what it was about quantum science technology and how that could affect their societies. And I'd say most countries in the world are actually developing countries. And they don't always have scientific attaches at their missions, and so it was very important to actually mix scientists. So we brought a scientific team to the UN, for instance, and we really were able to inform. And I think so. To answer your question, first of all, you have to get governments on board and understand what the problem and what the possibilities are. The second part is actually talk about access. And really talking about, let's say, access to quantum computing, because very few countries are able to actually invest in building a quantum computer, but getting access is actually very important. So the Open Quantum Institute, for instance, in Switzerland was very active during this whole process. And so that was, and that organization's behind democratizing access to quantum computing. And I know there are other organizations that are doing the same thing, and they're also connected with UNESCO. So we're working as a partner on that. And so I think the organizations like that are really helping out. I think you saw a lot of there's things not connected with the second revolution, but CERN, for example. So you have to remember that the United Nations was designed to bring peace. And so CERN was designed to bring stability to Europe. Sesame, which is a synchrotron, another accelerator in the Middle East, was designed to bring peace in that region. So both organizations are really created under the auspices of UNESCO, and that just means that that was enabled the governments to talk to each other and work together. So anyway, there are some precedents, and the last thing I want to say is there was really a British biochemist, Joseph Needham, who really, I think, designed UNESCO. And he noted back in the 40s, he was actually in China during the war, but called back to actually help found the organization. And he noted that scientists just normally work with each other across boundaries, and really needed to do this. So anyway, there's a long history, but science in particular.
Interesting. And I'm excited to see what more we managed to achieve in the International Year of Quantum. So keeping a very close eye and urging all of you to follow some of Joe's work as well. So we've heard from the government, we've heard from the multilateral organization. I'm curious, Matthew, if you could tell us a bit on the commercial perspective. We're seeing two very different approaches play out. There is, in the US, for instance, it's more big tech focused. It's pushed by big tech. There's some support from research, and the government role, if I had to say, was slightly limited. Whereas if you look at the other big competitor that everyone's talking about, China, it's more state-backed firms and research centers by state. So both these approaches have their critiques. One, you may think fragmented approach could slow down innovation. Another, you may think there is really no incentive for the private sector to outdo each other. It could foster less competition. So how, as someone from the commercial side, from the commercial perspective, what are you expecting governments to do to support you as you establish these cross-border alliances?
A lot of different parts of that question.
Yes.
So let me unpack it. I'll start with what am I trying to accomplish at Infleqtion, and that is to build a scalable technology business that can earn good gross profit dollars that are in excess of our operating expenses, our working capital needs, and our capital expenses, such that we ultimately generate a profit and provide products to our customers that they get a lot of benefit from and generate returns for our shareholders. Like that, at the end of the day, is what I'm trying to accomplish. And quantum is a very interesting one because we, as Infleqtion, do have products that provide value today in the form of our clocks and our sensors, but the computers aren't quite there yet. And so that is still very much in the realm of research, and that computers not being there yet is a global statement from quantum computing. And so normally I would say I'm going to bet on capitalism and competition every single time. And that comment still does hold here, but given the realm where quantum is still in that research area and needs to transition more to the commercial, it is helpful to have government support from the US and the UK and Australia and other governments for those in particular. And so I think the way I've been trying to work with government is they're obviously a natural customer for all of our products, but also both working a lot with Tom's group and the groups in Australia on how to leverage some of those research dollars to help us continue to commercialize those. And I think the challenge that a lot of commercial companies that are focused on the deep tech space find is making that transition from relying on research dollars to becoming self-sufficient based upon the sales of products. And so it's up to us to figure out how to navigate through that, but clear lanes from the government on how to transition from research to then flipping that to the products that they ultimately need and getting those out in larger volumes to provide value to those government customers. That's always the challenging thing, that any help that we can get on that front, I'm always grateful for. But again, it does fall on the companies to figure out how to navigate the swim lanes that have been put in place.
Sure, we can discuss a bit more about some of the probably the case studies and examples that you've worked through. But I do want to touch upon in the first segment on regulation as well and in policy making. Professor Davis, we're seeing with artificial intelligence, the approach to policymaking appears to be very fragmented. The technology is evolving at a very fast pace, and regulators are trying to keep up with it as well. So on quantum, as governments and companies are thinking about how to build these with an element of trust and accountability, but also national security in mind, what are the legal, ethical frameworks that companies need to keep in mind?
Well, it's such a timely question. Again, Aubrey Davis from the United States Air Force Academy. So I've been a professor there for 3 years, and I served for 32 years on active duty in various different roles. It's so interesting coming from the perspective of a service academy, because I'm at once a government employee, but at the same time, I'm also an educator, which allows us to go ahead and cross-linkage with a number of academic institutions. For example, we're in the process of publishing an article in the Richmond Journal of Law and Technology, which addresses this very thing. The lessons that one can learn from other emerging technologies, specifically really focusing heavily on things like AI, biotechnologies and things like that are a little bit more mature at the moment, but that can go ahead and give us some cross-linkages for how we should have the conversation. The kind of general thesis, and again, this is going to be all free access. This is typically the processes that I like to work on. And this is in collaboration with University of New South Wales, Purdue, Arizona State, Senator Dale O'Connell College of Law, to make it so that we can all have a baseline dialogue. So in a couple of weeks, you'll be able just to go to the Richmond website and download it for free. And what the article argues, and what has always been kind of my consistent thesis, is a couple of things. Yes, there are many things that we can learn from some of these emerging technology modalities. That is, hey, we already understand that once we deploy it, there's going to be things that we learn. It's going to have to be bolted on the back end. But the responsible conversation needs to be held up front. So when you're talking about things about global access and things like that, those are conversations that we already need to be having now. But I think the larger picture that you gain from looking at it from like, okay, what's going to happen? Like what types of things do we need to look at from a regulatory perspective now? It lowers the angst, right? So we talk a lot about the hype cycle and things like that. But if we're saying, okay, we're looking at this from a balanced approach, because we've already known that when we deploy emerging technologies, once it gets out in the field, we're not exactly sure where that's going to lead. I think that will lower the hype cycle in a significant manner. The other thing to think about is the regulatory space. In the United States, as in, in many countries, we have a complicated regulatory framework. It's basically 3 large executive branch agencies that deal with various aspects of quantum technology in various different ways. And so the Department of Defense, obviously a big player in that. But, we came late to this space in 2018, I would argue, was where we had the National Quantum Initiative Act. Everything else has been National Defense Authorizations Act, which has given us some different challenges with regard to the regulatory frameworks that are overlaying this. So you've got ITAR, you've got EAR, you've got DOE 810, you've got these other types of things that you're seeing right now from regulators. But you also have something that's very interesting happening in the Supreme Court. Now, some of you may have heard of kind of the end of Chevron deference, and I'm sure many in the room could raise their hands like, oh yeah, the Chevron issue that's going on right now. Well, essentially the Supreme Court has been activist in the sense of backing away from allowing regulatory agencies the ability to go ahead and interpret their own regulation. So in other words, you're dealing with a time now in the United States where you're going to see a fairly deregulated environment, which I think will lead really well into public-private partnerships, collaboration with private entities, which we have many of at the Air Force Academy. And so it's something to definitely be tracking right now, because whereas you may have seen a very heavy regulatory space in countries like China, or maybe perhaps even arguably in the EU, in the United States right now, you're going to see that sort of lowered to a significant amount, mainly because the Supreme Court has said that Congress, when you go ahead and you delegate to a certain agency, you have to speak clearly with regard to what they can and cannot do. Well, that's going to make it so that regulators really can't regulate a whole lot. And so it's a very interesting time in that respect.
I agree. And furthering the question on regulators taking the first step, it was interesting, and I think we referenced this earlier in the day as well, with the UK cybersecurity watchdog coming in and laying out that framework, saying that yes, it is a 2035 ultimate deadline, but this is how you work towards it in phases. What's some of the work? And David, I'll come to you as well for what we're doing at the Australian Trade Commission. But Tom, if you could walk us through with standards in particular, how are some of these working groups and collaborations with other countries playing out with regard to quantum?
Sure. So we actually outlined our approach to governing quantum technologies last autumn in a document you can find online, off the back of some advice we received from experts about how to think about this. And the headline there was we don't think it's right that you seek to rush to regulate quantum as a technology. Instead, you think about the individual application areas and build understanding, create the right principles for responsible innovation, and support regulators to regulate in their own field as you go. Standards is a really important part of that. And the UK is quite well placed to influence global standards here, because we've been at the forefront of some of the tech development and are well plugged into some of the international organisations that are working in this space. We've created a network for quantum standards involving the British Standards Institution, National Physical Laboratory, and UK Quantum. And the idea is to make it easier for the ecosystem to identify what it needs on standards and influence them globally, because obviously it's a very SME-driven ecosystem at the moment, and it's not easy for a given company to be in all those forums to express views. We're also lucky to be the Secretariat through the British Standards Institution for the first dedicated Global Standards Committee, JTC3, and working really closely with international partners about what that looks like. So I'm really excited to see what more comes from that. And I think it's really going to be critical to the adoption part of our strategy, because if you get standards right at the right moment, it just simplifies things for the whole ecosystem. And so we think it's really important that we're part of shaping that.
Interesting. David, if you could tell us a bit more about what you're working on at the Trade Commission.
Yeah, sure. I think Tom put it quite elegantly, I think. So at the Australian Trade and Investment Commission, we're the trade and investment agency, so we're focused more on the kind of commercial ties. We have the benefit of Australia and the UK having a relatively new free trade agreement, which is quite important nowadays, right? We're all realising. We're celebrating the 2-year anniversary of that free trade agreement, and it's not just about the reduction of tariffs on goods, it's much broader than that. There's extensive provisions that exist in that free trade agreement. You talked about mobility. There is an extensive number of provisions that will drive greater mobility between our two countries, and unique provisions for UK citizens and Australian citizens. But I guess just on the topic of standards, and again, we're not a policy agency or a regulator, but our Department of Industry and Science, DISA, has similar view to Tom. We support the development of international standards. Our ecosystem is, it's growing, but it's relatively small. We have 40 companies, of which 13 of those are international companies. So we think that there needs to be international cooperation in terms of standards. We think standards development is a good thing because it helps provide greater certainty for everybody, for the technology developers, for the buyers of that technology, for the investors in that technology, it goes on. We also, similar to Tom, we support that to be industry-led. And so we're leaning into the IEC and ISO Joint Technical Committee on Quantum Technologies. There's a number of multilateral forums as well. So the Multilateral Dialogue on Quantum, which we recently held in Australia, aligned with the Quantum Australia Conference, and the Quantum Development Group, which also we recently hosted Australia, aligned with that. And then we also have bilateral arrangements of which Australia and the UK have a joint statement on quantum cooperation. So there's lots of forums and mechanisms to help drive the development of standards and practices that are aligned with our respective interests.
It's interesting to see that this process has gathered momentum. And Joe, in this International Year of Quantum, are there any promising models that you've seen between countries? We've of course heard about UK and Australia, but among other nations or corporates who are trying to expand into other regions and markets, promising models of collaboration with regard to informing these standards?
Informing, yeah. So. One of the things that we're doing with UNESCO is simply convening. So having a few events where we're really bringing in the proper stakeholders. But in terms of our steering committee, actually we have representatives we heard about industry. So we have representatives from the Quantum Economic Development Consortium and also the EU Quantum Flagship and I think, and QUIC, which is the European Quantum Industry Consortium. So I think these are cross-border organizations that they have members that are international, and I think they don't set standards, but they certainly can inform through their member companies. And so I think that's where the direction we're going is just we have them on the steering committee. We're doing a couple of events coming up where this is going to be a topic, and we hope to get some papers out of that. But again, in general, we simply try to gather the right people together to talk about these things and see what progress we can make. We also have, in terms of communications, which I think, as far as I can tell, is probably the area where you really want to establish some standards pretty quickly for secure communications. And so we have a representative from the International Telecommunications Union, and it's usually unions which are setting these things. So, and she is on Gillian McNamara, and so she's on our steering committee, and I think she's also involved in many of these activities that we're doing. So anyway,
Great.
Yeah.
Before I move on to the next question, just a note for the audience, if you have questions, please scan the Slido code and send those in. We'll review them through the conversation. Matthew, the concept of national quantum missions and national quantum statements are something we're seeing a lot. They're being refined over the past 3 years. Like Professor Davis said, it probably came out in 2018, but we're still working on it across different countries. Investment figures are increasing. Public-private partnerships are on the rise. When at Infleqtion, when you think about a particular market or region, how do you go about aligning your commercial strategy with, say, a country's national quantum mission?
Mm-hmm. It is a little bit of a challenge because what we need to do to build a scalable company is really set a product direction and hopefully be able to service multiple markets with the same product as opposed to bespoke products for each market. So the way I think about it is, we try to gather feedback from what the needs are of the various different countries that we do business with. We have 50 folks in Oxford here in the UK. We have 5 folks in Melbourne, growing to hopefully significantly more over time. And I think about, again, there's the research side of things, and then there's also the how can we get into procurement contracts to provide products that actually provide value at scale. So you're threading a bit of a needle, and you're gathering the feedback from what are needed in each of the different geographies. You're feeding that back into your product roadmap and then trying to align the two as best you can. It doesn't always work that way, though, because funding cycles don't always line up. The requirements for sensors and clocks can differ between what the US needs and what Australia needs and what the UK needs. And so it's constantly just trying to put all that into a pot and make a stew out of it, basically, is what we do. And so I think, it's sort of along the lines of standards, but to the extent that the AUKUS partnership is a strong one, which it is if the relevant folks could align on what is needed from a quantum technologies perspective, ranging from timekeeping to sensing and ultimately computing, it would allow us to, instead of having to kind of build multiple times, you can build once and service a number of different customer needs, because the requirements usually aren't that different. There's just slight idiosyncrasies between them. And so so maybe if it's possible, a bit more alignment along the various quantum groups from the 3 countries to even create centers of excellence in one country versus another, and then we know, more what those various customers need at any given point in time.
Interesting. I like the bit where you said that the requirements happen to be somewhat similar. It's just probably phrased differently, different timelines, different investment goals, prioritizing in the different stages. Professor Davis, if I could come to you and try to understand, if you're a startup, you're a company that's investing in quantum, and you, like Matthew, are trying to go to different markets in different regions, how should you be thinking about issues like data sovereignty, data privacy? These policies are at varying stages. The developed world has gone ahead. The emerging economy countries, especially in Asia, are still trying to keep up with it. How should companies be approaching this?
Well, it's interesting. It's just a proclivity almost of what we're dealing with, and when you're looking at the frontier, essentially what's new knowledge. I mean, we're essentially building the bike as we ride it, and so as we've seen in other emerging technologies, we're seeing what they call the rise of soft law, which is a corporate governance model, which is bless you, which is a little interesting, right? It's this idea of like, well, wait a second, we're allowing the corporations essentially to go ahead and dictate governance, where that should be the government that does that, and so it's a very interesting time. And again, it's not trying to cast fault at all. It's just companies are just stepping in where the government hasn't otherwise done so, and we've seen that across almost every country that is developing quantum technology or is dealing with it in some meaningful way. And so is that wrong? Well, no. I think that's sort of the nature of what we're dealing with at the moment, which then allows us to go ahead and say, well, is this really going to work out? We know that there are some of the red lines out there, right? For example, equity, access. We don't want to have bias in our modeling, those kinds of things. Those are things that we can all agree on. And no matter where you are, you can go to any country in the world, and if it's fundamentally unfair, well, then that's something that we would all agree is like, yeah, we would absolutely not want this at all. And so let's go ahead and change our direction in order to do that. But with that at the end, I do think that it's important for us to take the time now as we're actually building the technology to also look at how we're going to responsibly govern the same, because that does provide certainty. It does give us the certainty if we're going to build a public-private partnership, well, you already know that if you're going to be partnering with the NIST, they're going to have certain standards, at least something that's going to give you an idea of what direction is north. Maybe you end up going northwest a little bit, and then you maybe come back. But at the end of the day, you know exactly sort of the cardinal direction that you want to head, and then we can start developing it more further.
Interesting. Nice way of putting the term of corporate governance, new form of corporate governance. I'll remember that. It's something that comes up in AI as well. Matthew, I wanna understand a bit more from you. When we've interviewed a bunch of small as well as big tech companies talking about their investments in quantum. If you're an enterprise or a startup that's thinking about, say, from Oxford or Cambridge or any of these research centers about going and addressing a particular market, do you think about going global first? Do you think about establishing it in the home market? How should one approach?
So before I came to Infleqtion, I was an investor for many years, and for a big chunk of that, an investor in small companies. And normally the advice I would give to small burgeoning companies is focus across all aspects. Focus on a product, focus on a market, focus on a geography, and don't spread yourself too thin too early. And I think that advice does continue to hold in the quantum world, but with some maybe not quite as strongly as I'd make it for others. And the reason is because the talent pool for quantum is very global, and you do need to look globally to find the best talent. The funding pools for quantum are also quite global, and so you do sort of need to look globally to find those funding pools. And so I think you probably might need to expand into different geographies from your home geography a little earlier in quantum, just because of the global nature of the talent pool and the funding pools.
Right.
But it's a little bit at odds with what normally I would say is just you find something and focus maniacally on it. And so I think it's a contextual. How do you contextualize focusing maniacally on whatever you're doing, and you happen to be spreading across a few geographies? But it is a very global market for quantum.
Interesting. Tom, any good examples of companies you've worked with here in the UK in terms of advising them and how they've approached this local versus global market question?
Yeah, well, I don't think it's for government to advise on when you take that judgment. But what we do is support our companies to internationalise when they feel ready. And I think what's interesting is we've kind of touched on it through the discussion. There is clearly a case of making sure you have kind of critical mass for your R&D operations. And we would obviously encourage everyone to build those in the UK because we've got great ecosystems to do it around. But it is a global market, as Matthew was saying, and agility is probably more necessary with this nascent technology than it might be needed in other fields. So we're seeing really great success stories of companies like Quantinuum and OQC selling into Japan, a large number of our quantum computing startups expanding into the US. And what's great is that it's consistent to do that and sell those products and while continuing to build your kind of home presence. So I don't think they're mutually exclusive. The other thing we'd say we're really focused on as a government is that access to talent picture is critical. And part of that might be going globally to find the talent, but we also want to bring that global talent to the UK as well.
Great. I now want to move on to the question of national security. And Professor Davis, I want to come to you. When I began covering 5G in, back in 2018, it was more about collaboration on the technology. And then very soon, national security became a very critical topic. We're seeing that with artificial intelligence. We're seeing that with high-performing semiconductors as well. For companies and governments to work together on quantum, while you're also thinking about innovation, you need to factor in the importance of national security. What are the frameworks that companies must keep in mind as they approach this challenge? Because this is a question that's going to come for quantum as well.
Well, absolutely. And, from the national security space, a lot of the discussion has been mainly focused on encryption and post-quantum encryption. So you're seeing a lot of startups in this space who are trying to address this problem from a national security perspective, and that is the exfiltration of data, and be that not just national security data, but your own data. One of the cases that I have all of my students read is the TikTok case, and I know many of you probably read it. It's only 40 pages, so it's easy read, bedside reading. But they were blown away that there would be a national initiative or an act, and to get something through Congress at this point is very difficult. But there was a whole act of Congress that dealt with the exfiltration of data that simply dealt with your user experience. And so, as some of you are on your phones right now, the TikTok algorithm was actually building, as and many of you know, was building an actual full psychological profile. And so then it was using that in a commercial sense to go ahead and target you with ads or other types of content. And so as I see it transfer from, we're worried that we're going to be spinning out, national security secrets. The larger issue to me, I guess at this point, is the stuff that's all publicly available that they can go ahead and use, find patterns, find users, because ultimately those are people that deal with the national security space, right? And so, it is, whereas you might see in GPS, a single point of failure if we're spoofed or we're not able to use it. I see as we develop this much more sophisticated type of technology that can make true inferences. If you're talking about what a quantum computer can do with artificial intelligence, it ultimately comes down to the people. And so I think that's one of our surfaces from a national security perspective that we need to be paying special attention to.
Interesting. David, is there some, I'm sure there is already a lot of thought that's going into national security, and that's probably at the crux of, any tech or especially emerging tech-related partnerships that you do at the Commission. But with specifically to quantum, how are you thinking about this, and what would be your advice?
Yeah. In terms of advice, I feel for governments, right? Trying to find that balance of trying to support the development of an industry, an emerging industry, while also trying to protect their national interests and potentially their economic interests, and also try not to provide something that could potentially be an asymmetric advantage to an adversary. So there's all of these complexities that we have to deal with. So the Australian government, we have a critical technologies list. So we've got a framework and a critical technology statement that tries to give a little bit of transparency in terms of the government's position and how we will approach critical technologies. It was interesting, Matthew, you talked a little bit about sort of the international kind of nature of quantum companies. I just want to touch on that quickly. We have a number of Australian quantum companies that are born global purely because they need to access talent. It's not all in Australia. They need to access funding. It's not all in Australia. They need to access customers, right? They're not all there. So by default, they're working internationally. They're partnering. They're collaborating, and it's really amazing to see that cross-pollination. And you also touched a little bit on AUKUS. I think frameworks like that can really help to drive a government-to-government ability to streamline the development of some of these technologies. So for those of you who know aware, AUKUS has two streams. The first is around the development of nuclear-powered submarines, but the second is around advanced technologies, of which quantum is one of those advanced technologies. And I think, sure, there'll be a number of probably discrete projects that the respective Australia, UK and US will work on. But I think probably the most important thing will come out of that is the framework, right? How do we share innovation across respective countries? How do we leverage the respective capabilities? How do we build respective industrial bases in the long term? How do we address some of the licensing constraints that we hear from businesses, quite often? So I think I'm really excited for what the AUKUS partnership will hopefully bring in terms of removing some of that friction and making it a little bit easier. And for those, reading some of the respective defence ministers' statements after the AUKUS meetings is a really good insight into the direction that they want to take.
Absolutely. I see we have got a couple of questions coming in, and two of these tie in with what I wanted to ask you, Joe, about the we call it the digital divide earlier. Now we're calling it the quantum. Someone's called it the quantum divide here. Essentially, how do we ensure? I know we're making steps not just at the multilateral level, but also government to government. But how do we ensure this is not, again, a digital divide between the emerging world and the developed world? What are some of the actions? I'm sure you're talking through some of these challenges at the UN as well.
Right. So, I mean, it's not only what we in the developed world are doing, it's what also the developing countries are doing. And so this is a really complicated question because there's many moving parts. One, we have to really ensure that there's a good quantum education, just science education in every country, just to begin. That's just the framework, and that's not for us to decide. We have to actually work with governments. And the other thing is that that's at a basic level, but also at advanced skills. So our organization, ICDP, which is a science center for UNESCO. I've been involved for the last 60 years in giving advanced training to scientists pretty much only from the developing world and keeping them updated. It's very difficult, many things, and just in terms of being able to follow the literature because it costs quite a bit. And so we have programs for that as well, just to make sure that, because you cannot be at the forefront of science if you don't know where the forefront is. And it's also very difficult to work alone. Abdus Salam was our founder, but he had to leave Pakistan and come back because he said there's nobody to talk to.
Yeah, that's an interesting story. Could you elaborate a bit more on the founder? I've heard a bit about it, but perhaps
Yeah.
for the benefit of our audience.
Yeah. Well. So Abdus Salam was he later got the Nobel Prize in physics, but he was before that he was a very good scientist obviously from Pakistan. But he came to Cambridge. He got his PhD. Went back to Pakistan, but he really felt he was isolated, and that sense of isolation. So in other words, he couldn't walk down the hall and talk to people about what he was doing. He couldn't actually collaborate. And in those days, it was pretty hard. There was no internet. You had to get on a ship if you wanted to go someplace. So at any rate, that was the reason we actually started the center, to end isolation of scientists. And so they didn't have to leave. So he said, either I leave my career or I leave my country. And he said, I chose to leave my country. And so we didn't want that. So he didn't want that to actually be the last thing that happened, that everybody leaves their country. And so how to keep people involved in a career and still be in their home country. So at any rate, so the advanced training and also education. So these things are going on. There are many groups around not just us. So there are many groups and many professional societies that are working around through Africa and other developing regions to bring that kind of advanced knowledge. So it's knowledge sharing, but also helping to have knowledge creation. The last thing, diversity is not a dirty word, even though it seems to be. At least where I come from. But it's not actually we actually understand it very well. And when you get fundamental problems in science, and we're going to find a lot of fundamental problems here, diversity actually plays a huge role, because often you can't just go in a brute force direction. You can't just hammer your head against the wall. You have to turn around and look at the problem in a different way. And we need as many diverse points of view, even the worldview, but it usually comes down to personality or what you had for breakfast. But at any rate, you really do need that way to approach problems. It's not just the technique, it's also how you approach the problem to begin with, because we don't know how to approach problems.
Yep. So focus on education, and of course there is precedence for bridging some of the digital divide gap on work on critical infrastructure with African countries. The ITU does significant amount of work, of course, in this regard. So possibly that could be a model. We're coming up on time, so very quickly, if I could just ask you to leave our audience with, we'd start with you, Professor Davis, and then come down. In terms of, if there had to be a couple of principles or a couple of guiding frameworks for companies to be able to ensure that you're prioritizing the national security mission, but you're also ensuring that you're going ahead on innovation and you're not slowing down.
So I'm always reminded in this sort of context of a small computer company that started in a garage, and all they had was a soldering iron, some transistors, and some plastic baggies. I think that one of the things that I think we really need to keep at the forefront is how do we spin out as much of the technology as we can to get it into the hands of the user. So not only are they competent and fluent in language, but they're able to mess with it, they're able to play with it, and they're able to code with it, and they're able to actually create some products even. And you can transfer that into a number of contexts. So there might be some sensitivities in the national security space, but I think the risk calculus is probably in favor of development, in favor of going ahead and sharing technology, and that will, in and of itself, I think, bolt on the ability to have these collaborative types of relationships, especially in a bilateral and multilateral sense.
Great. David?
Big question. Look, I think your question sort of revolved a little bit around advice for businesses, advice for companies. I think, I guess my ultimate advice is there's a lot of existing fora, there's a lot of existing pathways. Really lean into those existing pathways. We talked about a number of them on this panel. Bilateral engagement, of which industry needs to be, at the forefront of that, and part of that, and providing guidance to policymakers, to regulators, and those involved. Lean into those existing pathways. Free trade agreements, a little bit about new and revolved world of trade. Make the most of those existing mechanisms.
Interesting. Joe?
Well, of course, being in an international organization, but I'll speak for my own country. So I'm also involved in various physical societies. So I think, one of the problems recently was that there's, quite apart from classified research, there's research which is controlled but not classified. And then I think it creates a lot of uncertainty with scientists. Who do they collaborate with? Because if you collaborate, it depends on which country it is, because you can do the same collaboration with Japan that you cannot do with China, for instance. And so I think there's a lot of uncertainty there. And I'm not sure how to work around that, but I think sharing information, I mean, there's a trade-off, obviously, and I think companies do this too, right? You give away some information, but you don't give away everything.
Yeah.
But I think it's vital. This international collaboration is how science has been for decades. So I don't know how to do that, but I think certainly in semiconductor industry, you have a lot of problems with who you're collaborating with, and this is just a big uncertainty.
Right. I'm sure if we had to sit down for geopolitics, we'd spend a really long time here. So we will avoid that for now. But Tom, if
Such a shame we've been timed out. I think the thing I would say is obviously international collaboration is critical. On the question of how to do it safely, there is lots of guidance out there in the UK on thinking about research security, on navigating export controls. Come and talk to the right bits of government and we will help you think about that.
excellent, Matthew.
Double click on that, and just in terms of how to build a scalable business, know your customer, know what those customers' needs are, and build products that provide value relative to what they need, and do that all in the framework of obviously furthering national security for the right countries, and again, double clicking on what Tom said.
Excellent. So we're right on time. And I want to say thank you very much, gentlemen, for your insights and for your time. We're now quickly going to move on to our next session as well. But thank you so much. This was great.
Thank you.